one of the priorities that the Alliance has identified for our coming work is to support the mainstreaming of equalities and human rights throughout our work, and to take that approach in the work that we're doing to influence health and social care in Scotland. So, for example, in key policy developments such as the review of Scottish mental health law, the National Care Service, the incorporation of human rights is a key priority for the Alliance, and we're aware it's also a priority for many of our members. And in March 2021, the Alliance worked with Inclusion Scotland to call for the full and direct incorporation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People into Scots law. So we are planning on engaging widely with members, over the coming year on the incorporation of human rights into Scottish law as that develops. In addition to that, the Alliance also convenes the Action Group for Advancing Human Rights in Health and Social Care. And many of you might also be part of that Action Group who are joining us today. So this is a multi-stakeholder forum to really discuss relevant issues around health and social care, and from a human rights perspective. The group is made up of rights holders, duty bearers, and civil society organisations. In addition to that, we've recently joined civil society organisations across the UK to campaign against the plans to replace our Human Rights Act with a Bill of Rights. And we're really keen through the work of our Health and Social Care Academy to explore the development of resources and information which help people to engage in the practice of taking a human rights-based approach. How do we make that real? And really that's the focus of the Being Human series, is how do we bring this into practice, into our everyday, into our everyday work, our culture in Scotland, and particularly within health and social care. So without further ado, I'm really pleased to welcome Professor Alan Miller. So Alan is Professor of Practice in Human Rights Law. He was also appointed by the First Minister to serve as the independent co-chair of Scotland's National Task Force for Human Rights Leadership. And that has been, I guess from my perspective, quite a seminal change in our thinking and direction in Scotland around human rights incorporation. So I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you, Professor Alan Miller. And I know that you're also, you've recently been appointed as chair of the National Collaborative by the First Minister around how to take a human rights-based approach in the redesign of alcohol and drugs policy and services within Scotland. So really, thinking about how we do this work in practice, and I'm aware that some of your reflections are going to be on that Scottish context. And so really pleased to welcome you. And just again, before you kick off, please do, as you're listening to Alan's lecture, if you've got comments and questions, please do engage with us. This is a really important topic that we're discussing today.
Thanks very much to you, Sarah, and to all the colleagues at Alliance. And can I say at the outset, I've enjoyed working with the Alliance over many years in the field of human rights, and that's great to keep it going. And good morning to all of you out there, wherever you are. Can I say this straight up, that I think the title of the seminar series, Being Human, is great. I really love it because it gives an opportunity for myself and for all of us to think a bit bigger than we maybe do going through our everyday life, and challenge ourselves with some big questions. So I'm going to pose myself, and I suppose all of us, by doing that, three questions. So not so much a lecture, but just posing three questions for us all to think about and to exchange views about. The first one is, just taking the title of the series. The first question I would have in my mind, and what is it we need to be human? And then secondly, how do we achieve that in society, that we can all be human and feel that? And then thirdly, what's the leadership required at this particular moment of time in today's world, but particularly in and by Scotland? And so I just want to share some of the reflections I have working my way through these three questions, and then very interested to hear what others think, and if there's any questions, happy to field them as best I can. So on the first question, what's needed to be human? The answer is to live our lives with dignity. Human dignity is the essence of being human. And, it's, if you look at all the world's major religions, the golden thread that runs through them all is this idea of treating others as you would want to be treated, i.e. a sense of dignity that is well rooted in the major religions. And beyond the world's major religions, the age-old philosophies, values, and cultures say the same thing, that the pride of place going to human dignity. I don't know if any of you are familiar with, the works of Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa, but they talk, along with others, of Ubuntu, the philosophical values basis of many communities in Africa and elsewhere, of I am because we are. And that really goes to the heart of, I'm currently doing work with civil society and the government in Botswana on human rights and sustainable development goals. And what I'm finding there is that they have the same cultural basis and values base to their society. It's called Boto. And Boto means that you are able to achieve this sense of yourself, your worth, that you matter, your self-esteem in relation to others, in relation to the part you play in the community in which you live and work, etc. So it's really rooted in humanity, this sense of human dignity. And, in our world and in our culture in Scotland in the 21st century, it might be expressed as the need of a feeling of connectedness, or the language that a lot of you, I suspect, will use, is inclusion. And we saw the value that we all place on that through the pandemic, when we lost that sense of connectedness and inclusion. We were really challenged, and part of the impact of the pandemic was, how can we hang on to this sense of connectedness? Because we really felt how much we needed it when it wasn't in the forms that it usually was available, whether it's friends, family, colleagues, etc. And as Sarah said, I'm doing work now as part of the National Mission on Drugs Deaths, and public health emergency. 3 people a day die unnecessarily as a result of problem substance use. And it's a steep learning curve for me. But I found over the last few months, in just talking to as many people as I can who are experiencing or who have experienced problem substance use, that one of the biggest assets they have to get on a path of recovery is that feeling of being connected to others, of being valued, of being able to overcome the stigma and discrimination and inequality, and just feeling that they matter. I was talking to one the other week there, and we were talking about listening. And he said that in his journey through trying to get the sort of support that he needed for his problem substance use, he came to understand that there are 2 kinds of listening in his experience. He said, sometimes people listen to reply to you. He said, what really matters is when people listen to understand you. And there's a big difference between the two. And that to me goes to the root of this sense of worth, of esteem, of mattering to others, and therefore mattering yourself. I used to work a lot with Mary Robinson, the former Irish president, and Human Rights High Commissioner at the UN. And there's a lovely Irish phrase which captures this too, which is, it is in each other's shadow that we flourish. So it's everywhere. It's very much rooted in human experience, and the human dignity is what is needed to be felt in order to feel human. So the second question then is, how do we achieve this human dignity? From my point of view, the straightforward answer is through enjoyment of human rights. That if we enjoy the human rights that are inherent because of our humanity and are recognized because we need them to be human and to express our humanity, then we have to be able to enjoy these rights in order to fulfill ourselves and express our humanity in all of its dimensions. And at its core, I mean, you can write books and spend a lifetime talking and thinking about this, but what are human rights? But in many senses, and particularly relevant to, I think, this conversation this morning, at its core, in my experience, is the right of everyone to participate, and to participate in a very broad sense. So what I mean by that is to be able to be who you are, to be able to think and live independently, to be enabled by an environment, both the social environment and the natural environment, just to do that, to be yourself and to be able to think and live independently. And in order to do that, we all have to live in an environment in which it's possible to enjoy, for example, the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, or the right to education, the right to adequate housing, the right to food, the right to decent employment, the right to adequate social security, the right to take part in cultural life, and a healthy environment in which all of these rights are able to be enjoyed. So it's that wide range of rights and this sense of participation of the individual in the community in which he or she lives or works, and what we need in order to be able to participate, and without barriers being arbitrarily placed in front of this, or our humanity denied in some way for some pretext or another. So the third question then, if we sort of follow this train of thought, is, so what is the leadership required at this particular moment of time in the world and in and by Scotland that can help create this environment in which human dignity is encouraged to flourish, and being human is the norm? And it's quite a good time to be sort of posing this question. Next year, 2023, is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was agreed by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. And that was a real moment of time in the history of the world, because we had just come out of the Second World War, the Holocaust, the Great Depression, of the economic crisis in the 1930s. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a declaration that said, enough. We have to set a bar, and we have to set a standard of achievement to which every member state and every person and part of that state has to aspire to achieve. And it's now the foundation of all modern international human rights law, all the treaties that have subsequently been agreed by the United Nations. And so next year is the 75th anniversary, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has lasted in its influence this length of time in a sort of fast-moving world in which we now live, because it is rooted in this human experience. It connects the need of human dignity and human rights very explicitly in the very first words of the Universal Declaration. And then it goes on to connect the right of all of us to an enabling environment in which dignity and rights can be enjoyed. And then it also connects rights with duties. It's the duty of everyone and every organization to support and defend that environment in which everyone can express their humanity. So it was a monumental development in the world when that was agreed at that moment of time, and that was real leadership. Its progress, however, was then blocked or inhibited or distorted by developments that took place in the world. We all know that we don't live in a very ordered world in which things operate in the way that you planned they should do. So the aspirations of the Universal Declaration were to a large extent became very politicized and very weaponized by the Cold War, which ensued shortly after World War II. So you had the West, which championed individual rights, civil political rights, free speech, fair trial, privacy, and the Soviet bloc and beyond, which placed more emphasis on collective rights, economic, social rights, and standard of living. And it reflected the two different ideologies and outlooks on the role of the state, capitalism, socialism. So as a result of that, that vision of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, having this sort of wraparound of all the rights that we need to be human, was split. And we had, in the 1960s, two treaties came into effect, one dealing with civil political rights, which the West championed, and one economic, social, and cultural rights, which the Soviet bloc championed. And it became very politicized. It became a football in that geopolitical context. That then came to an end. There was another big moment of time in the development of human rights in the world at the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989. And then in Vienna in 1993, there was a World Conference on Human Rights, which reaffirmed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the fact that all of these rights were indivisible and they were universal and they were necessary to be able to be enjoyed in order to be human, whoever you were, wherever you were. So civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights were reunified following the Cold War. So that was a big, big landmark moment as well. However, sort of coming closer to home, the UK, which was clearly is the member state of the UN within which Scotland sits, chose not to incorporate, not to bring into UK law on an equal basis all of these internationally recognized rights. The UK maintained a view of civil and political rights being more important than economic, social, cultural rights. And so we have the European Convention on Human Rights, which is very important, but it deals by and large only with free speech, fair trial, non-discrimination, privacy, civil political rights, not the right to an adequate standard of living, to food, to housing, to social security, to education, to employment, to take part in cultural life, etc. So to bring it to the here and now in Scotland, next year, 2023, which by good coincidence is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, a big step, the biggest step that Scotland will have taken since devolution 20 odd years ago, will be taken in the field of human rights, where Scotland will be in its own way exercising human rights leadership. And there's going to be in the first half of next year, a public consultation on the forthcoming Human Rights Bill, which will be drafted next year and will then be presented to the Scottish Parliament for its consideration. And as Sarah said, the drafting of this bill will be based on the recommendations that were made and published last year in the report of the National Task Force for Human Rights Leadership. And its recommendations were that Scotland should take its biggest step forward, particularly in the light of the experience of the decade of austerity following the financial crash in 2008, then the experience of Brexit, sort of detaching us to a significant extent from the European human rights framework and placing at risk the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights from being applicable in the UK. And then COVID, which exposed the lack of economic and social resilience, the inequality, that it was the poor who suffered the most. And it was also the structural inequalities that were exposed. It was women and children and minority ethnic communities and those with disabilities who had the disproportionate impact of the effect of the pandemic. So we had reached a moment in time when something big had to be realized and a big step taken. And the task force recommended, therefore, that in all of that circumstance and context, we should establish a new human rights framework in Scotland, and it should be firmly rooted on incorporating, bringing into our law, policy, and practice that whole all-encompassing range of internationally recognized human rights found in the UN human rights treaties, agreed to by the UK in the UN, but not implemented within the UK, that Scotland should take the initiative within the limitations of the devolved competence, but as far as it possibly could do within those powers that it had, to ensure that people were able in Scotland to enjoy the rights that belong to us, because they're, as I said, what you need in order to be human. And human dignity was recommended, and I'm sure will be the underpinning value of the Human Rights Bill, and how all the rights contained within it should be interpreted. So amongst the treaties will be the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which means the right to an adequate standard of living, including food, housing, the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, the right to adequate social security, the right to education, the right to take part in cultural life. It will also include, as you well know, because you advocated so well for it, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I know at the last seminar, you were very fortunate to get the chair of the CRPD committee to talk about the treaty. And there will also be the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, and the Covenant against all forms of racial discrimination. And we know that already going through Parliament is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child being incorporated. So you will have these 5 UN human rights treaties sitting together in this new human rights framework in Scotland, which will also include the rights that we currently have under the European Convention on Human Rights. It will reaffirm them, so that civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights and the right to a healthy environment will all be set for the first time in a single place, that people can sort of look and say, so these are the rights I have. These are all the rights I'm entitled to. And these are the rights that public bodies have a duty to ensure are made real in everyday life, that they can be enjoyed by us all. So a transformational bill, it will, once effectively implemented, it will shift power from those who currently hold power to those who don't, and it will further develop a culture of the enjoyment of human rights. So this is not only leadership in Scotland or within the UK, it's very much to be seen as Scotland taking up its share of responsibility of leadership, which is required at this moment in today's world. Post-COVID, the UN has made very urgent and big demands on all member states, and not least also in the context of the climate crisis, to build back better and to place economic and social and environmental rights front and center in all the post-pandemic recovery efforts of all member states, learning the lessons of the need that the pandemic showed of increasing economic and social resilience. So improving health services, improving social protection and social security systems, etc., and ensuring that the structural inequalities are addressed, and the inequality is recognized as being something that was the cause of the disproportionate impact, not only within countries, but among countries as well. And these efforts of recovery should be very much aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, again passed by the UN in 2015, which are rooted in the international human rights framework and are very much a roadmap towards how we all should achieve this feeling of human dignity and the enjoyment of human rights. So this is happening in Scotland. It's not happening just because it's the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration and someone had an idea, well, why don't we pass a human rights bill to mark the anniversary? It hasn't come from nowhere. It came from much advocacy over the years. The Scottish Human Rights Commission, when it was created by the Parliament in 2007, from day one was advocating the incorporation of all of these rights. Civil society has taken up this issue, as Sarah was saying in her introduction, and not least the Alliance, with which I worked very closely when I was chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, and jointly carried out advocacy for this moment that we're now on the cusp of in Scotland. So what we have then is very much two human rights trajectories within the UK. At the UK level, we all seeing with our own eyes an increasing approach being taken at Westminster, which is a very backwards and very inward-looking approach, and what I would describe and others describe as, certainly internationally and with my colleagues, British exceptionalism. That Britain is sort of detaching itself from the international human rights system, and with a sort of very backward view that it need not be part of that international human rights system, that is for others and not for the UK. And we see it in a whole range of different contexts, whether it's to do with the Northern Ireland Protocol, whether it's to do with sending asylum seekers to Rwanda, whether it's to do with the British Bill of Rights and essentially neutering the European Court of Human Rights. So we have that trajectory. And then we have the other trajectory, which is that being taken by Scotland, which is progressive, it's forward-looking, it's outward-looking. And I was actually in a conversation with a senior UN colleague a few weeks ago, and he was saying to me, what on earth is going on within the UK, Alan? What is this British Bill of Rights? I mean, this is just difficult to understand why a country like the UK is contemplating doing something like this. And what's happening in Scotland, because we hear things are happening differently in Scotland. And so I explained to him these two trajectories and what we were trying to achieve in Scotland and what was happening currently at Westminster. And he then said, in quite a light-hearted, but not in a non-serious way either, and English wasn't his first language, he said, so Alan, you have this saying in English, don't you, a glass half full or half empty? And I said, yeah, that's quite a popular. And he said, well, it seems to me that, when we look at the UK, it's a glass half full or half empty, depending how you look at it, in the sense that you have still, maybe not for much longer, but you have still the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights. So civil and political rights, that's quite good. But of course, you haven't given the same status to economic, social, cultural rights, environmental rights, which is what the UN has been advocating for so long. But it looks like in Scotland, you are wanting to fill your glass. You want to bring these rights in and have a full glass. Whereas at Westminster, they seem just to want to empty the glass. I mean, is that what's happening? And I say, well, that is one way certainly of looking at it, and it's a moment when leadership has to be provided, both in Scotland and at Westminster, in order to have everyone's glass filled throughout the whole of the UK. So, whilst we do and should condemn the trajectory that the UK is taking us on in terms of what's happening in the reserved powers and the sort of exceptionalism from international human rights obligations, in my view, it's much more important that we can and we are setting ourselves on a different trajectory in Scotland. And my sort of life experience and therefore guiding philosophy has been that it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. So let's do everything we can now to improve the lives of people within Scotland and contribute internationally to that, because in so doing, we're reaffirming these international rules-based order and the international human rights framework. Better to do that. And that in itself not only reaffirms the international rules-based order and is very welcomed internationally, but also may help in the rest of the UK to demonstrate this is the trajectory that should be taken, and this is working, and this is improving people's lives, and a demand should be developed within civil society and others throughout the rest of the UK to take this up. And indeed, there are very positive developments in Wales who are coming up to actually learn from the task force process, because they are going to undertake something similar and introduce a Welsh Human Rights Act. And of course, Northern Ireland, there is a process currently stalled, but it's not going to go away for a Northern Ireland Bill of Rights. So there are these processes taking place throughout the UK. The British Bill of Rights has been parked, not gone away, will either come back in some form or another, or there will be piecemeal pieces of legislation coming from the Home Office, particularly in the area of asylum and immigration, that will be of the same ilk as the British Bill of Rights, and very regressive and exceptionalist and in breach of international human rights duties. So, in conclusion, next year, we will see the Human Rights Bill being consulted upon and drafted, and thereafter it will be presented to the Scottish Parliament. The approach that the task force recommended in drafting the bill, and the approach that the government has agreed, is what's called the maximalist approach. That is, the Human Rights Bill will give the greatest effect possible within the limitations of devolved competence to the internationally recognized human rights from the UN system. And I would encourage the Alliance and all of you to take the same maximalist approach towards then implementing the Human Rights Bill, so to ensure that its potential is realized and the rights are enjoyed in everyday life. So to really engage in all the ways possible with the preparation and development of the bill and then its implementation. So that would mean, for example, to really engage in the public consultation in the early part of next year. Then in the legislative process that will follow, there will also be statutory, non-statutory guidance developed about how these rights should be understood and applied, and models of practice and workforce development and training and all of that will need to take place. And I would hope that the Alliance, and I'm sure it will be right in the thick of all of that, and wider capacity building, public awareness raising will be absolutely essential. And any and all other means, please put your arms around it and see it as your means of bringing about the sort of society and the sort of country that you want to achieve. And just to leave you one example of what I'm saying is the process underway that the First Minister has asked me to help lead as far as the National Mission on Drugs Deaths is concerned. And the National Collaborative is a process for rights holders and duty bearers to co-design the redesign of drugs and alcohol support services and their delivery and their regulation. And as part of doing that, we will be working together and quite widely, and the Alliance, I know, is playing a role in this very constructively, to develop a charter of rights for people with problem substance use, and that these rights will be in anticipation of and integral to the new human rights framework that the bill will be introducing. So the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. This charter will be saying, what does that translate into everyday reality in the drugs and alcohol field? That right to health has been interpreted within the UN human rights system as meaning that there has to be availability of drugs and alcohol support services. They have to be accessible. They have to be acceptable and of sufficient quality. So you don't have to be a professor to see, oh, wait a minute. So therefore that means that availability, there should be those who want abstinence and recovery and residential rehabilitation. That should, those who want harm reduction and to find ways of living with dependence on substance, i.e. no one size fits all, but whatever the person wants to choose as their journey and how fast and how far they go, there should be that availability. Accessibility, so the stigma that currently is a barrier to people accessing the services because of how they are treated, how they are regarded, the lack of human dignity that is afforded to them. That has to be tackled in order that those who are actually losing their lives, by and large, are those who have no connection with the services because the services are not fit for purpose and they're steeped in barriers and stigma, that they have to be acceptable to people, i.e. individuals are coming from lives full of challenges, employment, housing, family, trauma, and the system has to be such that it recognizes that it sees the person for who they are, where they've come from, how they present themselves in the whole, and not just as a statistic or a medical need that can't be met, and mental health support can't be given until you resolve your addiction and catch-22s, all of that. And then the workforce who provide these services have to be trauma informed. They have to be made aware of the effect of early adverse childhood experiences and how that presents itself in someone who's now coming with problem substance use. So a whole system change, but based on not just charity or needs or a nice thing to do, based on the rights of those, including those with problem substance use, and the same as everyone else, the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, and the duties therefore on public bodies to do what is needed in order that that right is made real in everyday life. And therefore it's shifting the power between those who are disempowered and those who currently have the power, and that imbalance lies at the heart of the public health emergency that we have in the drugs field. And then an implementation framework. How is this Charter of Rights put into practice? The need for workforce development, the need for models of good practice, the need for independent advocacy and complaints procedures, the need for human rights-based monitoring by the scrutiny bodies to ensure that these duties are being carried out. And as a last resort, if all that fails, as inevitably it will, because we're all human, we're all flawed, there has to be access to justice. and it has to be easier access to justice than it is just now. And again, barriers removed, and access to justice afforded in a way that doesn't place the onus on the individual to take on the whole system, with the financial and emotional resources that are required to do that. And that the courts are given the powers to not just deal with one complaint individually after another, but to say this system is not fit for purpose. It's not providing the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental. So the system has to be brought into line, and to invest that power in the courts to be able to do that. So that's just one example of maximizing the implementation. Even before the bill is passed, we are already in anticipation of that, saying this is the trajectory that we are on, and we're going to be right in with the bricks of this. And the National Care Service, being established in the next few years, we would hope through the National Collaborative to have a positive influence, to be the candle that can say, this is how the landscape has to change. This is the human rights-based approach, public health-based approach towards some of these social problems that for too long have been dealt with as a criminal justice issue and steeped in stigma and discrimination and inequalities, etc. Enough. You can see I'm a man with a mission as far as that's concerned. So thanks very much, Sarah. I hope that's been of some interest, but we'll see from the discussion as to what others think about some of that, or indeed anything else. Thanks.
Well, we have reached the end of today's lecture, talk, discussion. All I can say is thank you so much, Professor Alan Miller. It's been an incredible, thought-provoking session this morning, and the comments attend to that. Terrific talk. Practical, human, but also setting us in the context that we're in. So thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it personally. I think someone else has also said thank you for being, such a leader as well within Scotland in this space. And I know that your contribution is not just within Scotland, and you still also are working with the UN and internationally to support this progressive development of human rights internationally. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and to those who are listening later once the recording is available. And please do continue to engage with us in this Being Human lecture series, and also engage in this really important topic in Scotland. As Alan was saying earlier, there will be opportunities for us to continue having this conversation in Scotland about how we ensure that the Human Rights Bill is that enabling bill and is followed by implementation. So I look forward to continuing to engage with many and all of you on this important topic.